This morning I want to talk about resolving conflict. There was a husband, bought a brand new car. He's looking forward to driving it to work early the next morning. He goes out to his car parked on the street, climbs inside, turns the ignition, nothing. He inadvertently had left the lights on all night, and so his car wouldn't start because his battery was dead. So he goes back into the house, wakes his wife, asks her for help. She comes outside. He doesn't have any jumper cables, so he said, "Sweetheart, if you'll push me at 30 miles an hour in your car, then I can get it started." And she had this curious look on his face. He was in a hurry, so he went ahead and got in his car, and she said, now wait. Close the door, men. So in a huff, she jumps into her big car, and he remembers looking in the rearview mirror, watching her start the car, and instead of pulling up behind him, she drives around him. He's like, "Oh, great. I've made her mad again." He's trying to figure out how he's going to work through this when she disappears around the corner, and next thing he knows is she's coming around the corner behind him. He looks in the rearview mirror, and he realizes that she's obeying his instructions perfectly. She is going to help him at going 30 miles an hour. He remembers in that moment thinking, I should have been a little bit clearer in my instructions. So it's just an illustration of how conflicts are apt to happen. I mean, sometimes conflicts, did that make sense? She hit him going 30 miles an hour. Okay. So sometimes conflicts happen because of disagreements, sometimes misunderstandings. Sometimes it has to do with us just being selfish. Somebody doesn't get enough sleep the night before. Could have to do with a medical problem. All kinds of reasons for conflict. And they come in all kinds of different forms. Sometimes it's an internal conflict. Sometimes I make you mad. Sometimes you make me mad. The question is, when a conflict or misunderstanding or disagreement occurs, how is it that you work through that so that you get the conflict really resolved? Typically, when it comes to navigating conflicts, we do instinctively what we saw our parents do. We follow the model of our parents. So that didn't work real good for me. My dad, the way he modeled conflict resolution was by blowing up and physical violence. My mother wasn't much more of a help. Instead of blowing up, my mom clammed up and engaged in passive-aggressive behavior. Like if you made her mad, she wouldn't talk to you for 4 days. There was an article in the Huffington Post that interviewed 100 different counselors, and they agreed that the two most common causes of divorce and marriage is an inability to communicate and an inability to resolve conflict. Because of the home I grew up in, I was destined to be incapable of enjoying long, meaningful, lasting, deep friendships because conflicts happen, and I had no idea how to get them resolved. What's more, any marriage I would enter into in the future was doomed for failure. It was in the midst of that relational dysfunction that God did two things. One, I met my wife. Stacy was a miracle from God. It became quickly apparent my incapability of resolving conflict, but she was willing to hang in there while I kind of learned how to do this relationship. So one of the things the Lord did was Stacy. The other thing was Jesus. So when I met Christ, several things happened. One, all my guilt was gone. My sin was forgiven. What's more is he changed my nature from being absorbed with myself to where I really loved and was concerned about other people. What's more, not only did he change my nature and give me a new power, but Jesus began to teach me from his word how to resolve conflict. The most amazing thing happened. I mean, obviously, I'm not perfect, and I don't always get it right. But in my marriage, God has done an incredible thing. What should have been the weakest part of our marriage has actually become the strength of our marriage. If you ask my wife, What is the strongest part of your marriage? My wife will say it's our ability to communicate and to resolve conflict. In fact, in getting prepared for this morning, I asked her for some illustrations of some conflicts we had been through. And neither one of us could really remember anything because they really are gone and dealt with. Amazingly quick, they're gone and they're dealt with. The Lord has taught me how to resolve conflict. By His grace, we're where we are. I kind of hesitate to say this because, she and I will probably have this big conflict this afternoon. But as of right now, everything is really good. And what I want to do this morning is just share with you what the Lord has taught me about how to resolve conflict. So last week, we looked at some broad principles involved in conflict resolution. This morning, I want to just kind of give you the specific strategy that the Lord has kind of shown me from His Word. Hopefully, it'll be helpful to you. It'll be different from other messages I've done. Typically, those of you who have been around for a while, I'll work through one specific passage. So the Bible has tons to say about conflict resolution. So instead of working through one specific passage, I'm going to look at 395 different passages. Not that many, but it may feel that way. But I'm just going to look at a bunch of different passages and what they say about conflict resolution. But everything really breaks down into 3 steps. Resolving conflict, the first step is you got to evaluate your motives and ensure that they're pure. Before you ever engage with the other person, you stop and you evaluate your own motives and make sure they're pure. Typically, when somebody gets mad and they engage in conflict resolution, their goal, their purpose in that is to be right. They want to prove, they kind of can become this prosecuting attorney, and their goal is to be right. The writer of Proverbs would call that person a fool. Proverbs 14 says, fools mock at making amends for sin. In other words, it's the fool that's never going to acknowledge any guilt. It's a fool that insists on being right. They're a fool, but the upright are different. The upright, instead of their goal being to be right, the goal of the upright is to be reconciled. They recognize that person is not their enemy, it's their spouse, it's their friend. And so as they approach this conflict, they approach it with this goal of being reconciled. And look what happens. But goodwill is found among the upright. As a result, they enjoy favor both with God and they enjoy favor with men. When it comes to a conflict, the first thing you got to do is evaluate your motives and make sure that they are pure. Why is it so important that we resolve conflicts? Why is it so important that we start with not trying to be right, but we try to be reconciled? Let me give you 3 reasons real quick why it's important that we resolve conflicts. 1, because we're fighting for the unity of the church. As the New Testament talks about conflicts regularly, it's in the context of unity in the body of Christ. When we fail to resolve conflicts, the unity in our church is fractured. Let me show you where Scripture teaches us. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 3, Paul says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Protect the unity in the church. Well, how do you do that? As you move through chapter 4 of Ephesians, he points to a number of things that you need to do. One of those comes in verse 26 when he says, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger, and so give the devil an opportunity. When we fail to resolve conflict, that is when anger becomes sinful and Satan comes in and fractures the unity in the body. We've got to fight for conflict resolution, for unity in the church. Secondly, for the glory of Christ. I mean, how is Christ put on display for the world to see? Jesus said, it's as we love each other. By this, all men will know you're my disciples, if you love one another. But if we fight and quarrel in an attempt to be right, we don't put on display the love of Christ. What we put on display is our own pride and our own anger. We've got to fight for resolution, for the glory of Christ, for the unity of the body, and for the health of our family. Last week I showed you this proverb from Proverbs 17. Whoever loves a quarrel loves sin. Whoever builds a high gate invites destruction. To remind you, in Solomon's day, they had a problem with thieves breaking into homes. And so what they would do is they would build low gates as entrances to their courtyard so that a thief couldn't ride in on horseback and destroy their house. But there was a group of people, royals and people with a lot of wealth, who valued that and wanted to show that off. So instead of building low gates, they built really high gates. Solomon sees that and he says, you know, a high gate, you build a high gate, it just invites destruction into your home. Thieves can break in and destroy your family. And then he likens that to an inability to resolve quarrels. Whoever loves a quarrel loves sin. If you don't resolve conflict, but instead you heatedly argue with each other and leave it unresolved, you put your whole home at risk. You doom your kids to an inability to relate to others as they get older because relationships involve conflict resolution. And the whole environment of your home will be angry and unhealthy. So God says, for the unity of the church, for the glory of Jesus Christ, and for the health of your own family, you've got to resolve conflict. And the first step to doing that is evaluate your motives, to make sure they're pure. Make sure, as you kind of begin this conflict, that you're fighting not to be right, but to be reconciled. And then there's a second step you have to take. After you evaluate your motives, then you need to begin to examine, step 2. You need to begin to isolate or examine your thoughts and ensure that they're true. So still you haven't engaged the other person yet. But you've checked your motives. Now you're starting to think about why you're mad. You isolate your thoughts and make sure that they are true. That comes from a passage that we looked at quickly last week, James chapter 4. In James chapter 4, he's asking a question. And that what is it that causes these heated arguments among you? And he lays out this process. Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but you don't have, so you kill. You desire, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. The process that James lays out looks like this. Quarrels, fightings, heated arguments begin with these kind of neutral desires we have. Quite often those neutral desires go unrealized. So, kid, I want a car. I want a new car. Parents say no. So desire for car goes unrealized. As a result, the kid gets angry. And this war begins in their mind, this internal war. On one hand, they have these true thoughts. My parents love me. And the reason they're not buying a car is they're trying to teach me to be responsible, and they're also, taking care of their own future, so I get it. But then on the other side, you've got these sinful thoughts. They don't love me. They are so stinking selfish. They could, kind of give up a little bit of their money and buy me a car, but no. So you got these two warring thoughts. And what happens is when we listen to our sinful thoughts, we get these heated arguments that break out. So the way you deal with this, the way you resolve this conflict, is you deal with this internal war. That's how you handle your anger. You isolate those thoughts and determine what's true and what's sinful. So how do you do that? I find this part extremely helpful. So when it comes to kind of isolating thoughts, particularly men have a hard time doing that. And that's because we can feel, but we don't know how to process our feelings. So to kind of determine which thoughts are true and sinful, what you need to do is just ask yourself 4 questions, okay? First question is this: what caused it? What am I angry about? That's a pretty easy question. I'm angry because she didn't. I'm angry because he. What is the thing that caused you to be angry? The second question goes deeper. And that's, why did that make you angry? It's put differently. Is my anger due to fear, frustration, or hurt? Every time you get angry, it's for one of those three things or a combination of those three. Ask yourself, okay, what am I angry about? And why is it that that made me so stinking mad? Let me give you an example. Last week, part of what we do each month here is we have to kind of look at all our expenses to make sure they're legitimate. So, I have a budget, I have expenses, I have a credit card, church credit card to use and stuff. We get this, report each month. You look through there, give them your receipts, all that stuff. So I'm looking through that deal, and I noticed that there's a charge from Logos Bible Software for $1,700. So I like the idea of buying $1,700 worth of stuff from Logos. I just don't remember doing it. So I felt a little panicked in that moment. So quickly logged into my account on Logos, looked at my orders, and sure enough, there was an order for $1,700. Evidently what happened was I was interested in a commentary set. To see the price of that set, I had to put it in my cart. So I put it in my cart. It was way too expensive, but I failed to delete it out of my cart. So a little bit later on, when I bought a couple free books on my phone, I failed to see it was still in my cart, and I bought it. So now I'm really panicked. So I go on and chat with Logos Bible Software customer service. Chat with them. I explain the whole situation. Didn't mean to buy it. It just somehow I bought it. And what can we do? And the lady on the chat thing said, you're 4 days past the return date, so the purchase is yours. And I felt myself get really angry. So I knew what caused my anger. I mean, I'm stuck having to pay $1,700. But why did that make me so mad? So I walked through this grid: fear, frustration, or hurt. Truth is, I was angry because I was afraid. I mean, my integrity is important to me. Church gives me a budget, but if I spend $1,700 out of budget, that makes me look like I lack integrity. So I was afraid of losing my integrity. I was frustrated. I was frustrated because I was having to pay for something that I really didn't want. And I tell you, I was frustrated because I couldn't fix it. I wasn't in control. And then, frankly, fear, frustration, I was hurt. I mean, I've been a Logos customer for 25 years. 25 years I've been buying stuff from them. For 25 years I've been sending other customers to them. Evidently, they don't value loyalty like I do, and I was a little bit hurt. So that's what you do. Why am I mad? Or what made me mad, and why am I mad? Fear, frustration, or hurt? Then there's a third question that you ask yourself, and that's, do I need to have a conversation with God? So in this case, that's exactly what I needed to have. It's a conversation with God. Lord, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that I'm going to sacrifice my integrity. I'm also frustrated. I'm frustrated because I can't fix it. I'm not in control. And Lord, I need you to remind me that you're in control, that you love me, and that you are good. So also there was this little deal about entitlement I evidently was feeling because I'd been a loyal customer that I had to talk to God about a little bit. But that's what you do. You have a conversation with God. Frankly, sometimes, unless you've already blown it and somebody else knows you're mad, at this point, the conflict is resolved because it's all internal. But oftentimes, your anger is seen by other people, which leads to a fourth question, and that's, do I need to have a conversation with someone else? In the case with Logos, I did need to have a conversation with somebody else. Potentially, if that $1,700 charge didn't go away, I needed to have a conversation with the finance committee. And I thought it was fair to have a conversation with Logos about my customer loyalty. In fact, I did, and they graciously forgave the $1,700. No conversation with the finance committee. But that's the process you go through to isolate your thoughts. So you can kind of get rid of the sinful things in a conversation with God. But in the process, you're going to find some things that are true that are going to mean you got to have a conversation with somebody else. So you've evaluated your motives. You've then isolated your thoughts. And now it's time to begin having a conversation with the other person that's involved in the conflict. At this point, you do a couple things. The first thing you do is you purpose to stay away from any inflammatory speech. So if they get on the defensive in this process, then you've just engaged in a losing battle. You're never going to get the thing resolved. And so you got to work as hard as you can to keep them off the defensive. One of the things that's going to put them on the defensive is inflammatory language. So that means you've got to make a commitment when it comes to inflammatory language that you're never going to falsely accuse someone of something. So there's a proverb that speaks of that. Without wood, a fire goes out. Without gossip, a quarrel dies down. The word gossip is a really interesting word there. It means two things. On one hand, it means a talebearer. It means somebody that is hurt or fearful or frustrated, and instead of talking to the person about it, they go to their friend and they run down the person that did that to them. That is a gossip. And you do that, the writer of Proverbs says it's like putting wood on a fire. What is a level 1 quarrel will turn into a level 3 quarrel, and that's not what you want. And so you're not going to wrongly accuse anybody to somebody else. The word gossip not only means talebearer, but it can also mean whisper or sigh. So another way you can accuse the person is by doing this. or You do that, and what you've just said to them is, we're done. I have made up my mind. It doesn't matter what you say. You are guilty, and it is over. You talk about escalating the conflict. You have just done it. Don't talk to other people, and surely when you're talking to them, don't go. So never falsely accuse. Never raise your voice. Proverbs says a hot-tempered man stirs up dissension. Dissensions, again, is a word for a loud, heated argument. Hot-tempered man, the Hebrew word there, means somebody who visibly displays their anger. It can refer to somebody who yells, somebody who throws things. It can refer to someone who pounds on the table or who punches the wall. You do that, all you do is escalate the emotion. The proverb says, but a patient man who takes time to remind himself of why we're engaged in this, who takes the time to isolate his thoughts, who processes things, it's that man who de-escalates the conflict. So I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm not going to falsely accuse. Inflammatory speech includes speaking quickly. That's the person who foolishly, as soon as the conflict happens, as soon as they get mad, they jump into that conflict with both feet. Every fool is quick to quarrel. But it's the honorable man who avoids strife by processing things. You know, last week I mentioned from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, don't let the sun go down on your anger. A lot of people think that means don't let the sun set while you're still mad. But that is a misinterpretation of the verse. What God is saying is don't let the sun set, not on a clock, but on your anger. And sometimes you just need time to process it, to make sure you understand your own emotions, your own thoughts, before you engage with the other person. It's a fool that engages too quickly. And then finally, never insult. The proverb says, drive out the mocker. And out goes strife, quarrels, and insults. What is a mocker? A mocker is somebody who ridicules and belittles another person. Sometimes the insults can be verbal. You know, my mother always told me that you would, or, you know, every time we do this, you know, those kinds of insults. Sometimes it's a verbal insult. Insults, though, also can come by interrupting the other person. You know, if they're kind of explaining themselves and you interrupt them, you have just insulted them. And what you're going to do is escalate the disagreement. So you got to, when it comes to controlling my reactions so that they're healthy, the first thing you got to make sure is that you stay away from inflammatory speech. Second thing you got to do is you got to work hard to understand the person. I love this proverb. This proverb says, the purposes of a man's heart are deep waters. That means that they're unknown to me, and oftentimes they are unknown to the person. What's going on in their heart, what motivates them. In this case, what has made them angry or why they said what they said, oftentimes they don't know. It takes a person of skill, a person of understanding to draw that out. So you want to stay away from inflammatory speech, but you also want to work hard to understand them. How is it that you understand the other person? A couple things. One is you got to be attentive. You can't be distracted, but you've got to be in the moment. Your physical expression must indicate that you are receptive to hear. That means watching your facial expressions, watching your body position. So when Stacy and I are engaged in a disagreement, I evidently have a propensity to get a sour look on my face, which doesn't help matters. So I'm having to learn to pay attention to my facial expression because my facial expression is not communicating what I want it to communicate. Body language, physical position is important. I found with my kids, if we're in a disagreement and I'm standing over them, then that just makes them defensive. But if instead I will sit down in front of them, I make myself vulnerable, suddenly they don't feel very defensive anymore. So be attentive, be receptive, and then understanding people are intensely curious. So they don't dismiss other people's emotions, like don't feel like that. Instead, they explore with questions to understand why the person feels the way they feel. So if I'm the one that has been hurt, I'm the one who's angry, and I'm exploring with Stacy or one of my kids or a friend, trying to figure out why they did what they did. When it comes to being curious, I'm going to make sure I do two things. One, I'm going to engage in I conversation instead of you conversation. I conversation puts it on me. You conversation points the finger and puts them on the defensive. For instance, you conversation would be, you said that I never take out the garbage. You know that I do take out the garbage. Maybe I haven't taken it out this week, but I do take out the garbage. How dare you? So it puts folks on. I conversation says, so I heard I never take out the garbage. I realize that you probably know I do take out the garbage, but I'm not sure what was intended by that. Can we kind of work through what that meant? You know, so it's putting the focus on me. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about feelings instead of facts. So feelings look like, you know, when I hear I never take out the garbage, that honestly hurts my feelings. And the reason is because I love you and you are so valuable to me. The last thing I want to do is not serve you. So can you help me process my feeling? Instead of saying facts, you said I never take out the garbage. Let's look at the calendar, you know? So that's how I'm curious. When the other person is upset, being curious looks a little bit different. So instead of the I, you, and the facts versus feelings, what I'm going to do is remind them of motives that, you know, we're not trying to be right. We love each other, and we want to be reconciled. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to walk through the isolating thoughts thing. I'm going to say, so what was it that made you so mad? What was it about that made you feel that way? Did I make you afraid? Did I hurt your feelings? Are you frustrated about something? So coming out of that, what do you need to hear from me to resolve this deal? And then third, when it comes to controlling my reaction, I need to avoid inflammatory speech, work hard to understand, and then third, I need to grant and ask for forgiveness. So sometimes by the time you get through the working hard to understand, the conflict is resolved. Oh, that's not what you meant by that. I understand that. So we're good. You know, sometimes it's like that. But sometimes I've behaved like a buffoon, and so I have to ask forgiveness. Or sometimes the wrong is on the other side, and they've got to ask me for forgiveness. So in that case, I've got to grant them forgiveness. What does forgiveness look like? Look at the latter part of this verse. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has grievance against someone, what does that forgiveness look like? Forgive as the Lord forgave you. How has the Lord forgiven you and me? Well, he no longer remembers our wrong. Psalm 103 verse 12 says, as far as the east is from the west, so far has the Lord removed our transgressions. 1 Corinthians 5:19 says that he no longer counts our sins against us. It is gone. And not only is the sin no longer remembered, but you and I are now regarded as completely righteous. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us so that in him we might become the very righteousness of God. That's what forgiveness looks like. Forgiveness means I don't hold it against you anymore. Yeah, how do you get to the place where you're able to forgive like that? Somebody really hurts you. How can you forgive like that? I think the key comes in this line, forgive as the Lord has forgiven you. So you take time to reflect on how much the Lord has forgiven you. So at this point in my life, I've lived a lot of years. The longer I live, I realize that I've sinned not once a month, not once a day, not once an hour, but I sometimes am sinning once a minute. And that's a lot of sin. This enormous pile of offense against God has built up. And yet in Christ, it is all forgiven. And as I realize that God has forgiven me the enormity of my sin, forgiven this person this one offense is not so hard. Real quickly on forgiveness. So if they're asking me to forgive them, then it's no problem because of what Christ has done for me. If I need to ask forgiveness, there's a way that you need to express that to a person so they know that you really mean what you're saying. Sometimes when we say, hey, will you forgive me? You know, it's like, I know I got caught, so let's forget about it. But there's a way you can express it so that they know you really feel what you've done. I would encourage you to say 4 things. One is, hey, this is what I did. I realize now this is what I did. This is what I should have done. Next time, by the grace of God, I plan to do this. Will you forgive me? So I mentioned at the beginning, Stacy and I's relationship started off pretty rocky, and that's because of my inability to resolve conflict. But thankfully, you know, she was patient with me, and I was in relationship with a Savior who was in the process of empowering me and changing me. I remember it was Valentine's Day, and man, I was so in love with this girl. You know, that was a great opportunity for me. So for Valentine's Day, I had a dozen roses delivered to her office. I took her out to a really nice restaurant to eat. I went shopping for a card, like shopping for a card. And then I not only bought the perfect card, but I wrote this whole, you know, verbose expression of my great affection for her. You know, even had to close it and wrote on the back, you know, it's pretty cool. So I give her all that stuff. We go to dinner, and about halfway through dinner, she says, oh, I have something for you. And she kind of fumbles through her purse, and she pulls out a card, slides it across the table. I open it up and it just says, Stacy. So I know this is pretty selfish of me, but I got mad. I mean, but by the grace of God, he'd been teaching me at this moment. And so, in that moment, I thought, she is not my enemy. And my goal is not to prosecute her, but to not to be right, but to be reconciled with her. And so I began to work on my thoughts. It was obvious what made me mad, but why was it that made me mad? Fear, frustration, or hurt? One, it was a little bit of hurt. And then a little bit was fear that she didn't feel the same way about me that I felt about her. And hurt that she didn't do for me, I'm embarrassed to say, what I had done for her. So I understood what was going on with me, and I needed to have a conversation with her about it. So I wanted to control my reaction. So I stayed away from any inflammatory speech, and I worked hard to understand. And I remember asking her a question. I said, so growing up in your family, what holidays were celebrated by your mom and dad? And she said, at our house, Christmas was a really big deal. Easter was a really big deal. And then she continued. She said, but what's funny is Valentine's Day was never a big deal in our family growing up. My dad may have gotten my mom a card and signed it, but my mom never really did anything for my dad. And then she said, as a matter of fact, I appreciated everything you did today, but I was a little bit caught off guard because that's just not the way that I was raised. She did that, and it was done. Conflict was resolved. It doesn't always go that simply, but it has made a tremendous difference in my marriage, walking through these steps. So I hope a couple things are clear. One is that unresolved conflict is a big deal. Hurts our church, hurts the glory of Christ, and it hurts your family. I hope it's become clear that God cares a lot about helping you resolve conflict. His word is filled with truth to help us do that. So it's a big deal. God wants to help. And I guess third, I hope you walk out of here feeling like it's really possible. It's really possible that we can, when we have a disagreement, to get it genuinely resolved so that we're closer together after the conflict than we were before the conflict ever occurred. That's the kind of work that Jesus Christ does in people. Would you pray with me?